Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to Good Orderly Direction, Practical Tools of the Bible. Today we are discussing Exodus 32, the golden calf, and this is part 1 of 2 because it is just chock full of useful lessons and information. I'm your host, Dr. Donnelly Snipes. So as I said, there is a lot to cover in this chapter, and I've broken it into 2 parts, so we try to do it justice. Part 1 is basically a recap of what has been learned until now and why God may have done this to either test or teach the people, making the implicit lessons more explicit. And I say may because obviously I don't know what God's intentions were. All I can do is speculate with the wisdom that I have, with the knowledge that I have, and you may arrive at different conclusions. Part 2 explores Aaron's motivations for the golden calf and the significance of the people's actions. And joining us today is Mojo. He is my kitty. After Moses had been on the mountain for a long time, the people told Aaron, "Make us an image of God who will lead us. Moses brought us out of Egypt, but nobody knows what happened to him." Okay. So they had been following this pillar of smoke they believed was God for a long time. And at this point, remember, they had been oppressed for hundreds of years. And now they were free and they were still trying to figure out how to self-govern. And they had been following this pillar of smoke, the old adage, seeing is believing. It's also worth noting that in this statement, they say Moses brought us out of Egypt. So they may have begun idolizing Moses, which we know is a great big old no-no, because God brought them out of Egypt through Moses and Aaron. How do you continue to have faith and do the next right thing in the absence of someone explicitly telling you what to do? If somebody's not standing over you telling you this is how you should act, this is what you need to do next, trust me, I will provide for you. How do you continue to have faith and put one foot in front of the other? As children, how did you go from being told what to do to thinking for yourself and applying that knowledge? So think back to even when you were very, very little. You went from your parents setting out your clothes to choosing your own clothing. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but obviously if you're wearing a wool sweater and a snowsuit in the middle of summer, that's going to be really uncomfortable. And if you're wearing summer clothes in the winter, that also probably will be uncomfortable. So through experience, you have learned how you're supposed to dress in different seasons. And now it's time for you to try to apply that as you start learning how to set out your own clothes and dress yourself. The same thing is true with coping with problems and distress. Initially, you don't have those skills. Your caregivers help you learn those skills and mold those skills in you as you grow. Once you get older, once you're in high school, once you move out, then it starts becoming more incumbent upon you to put those lessons into practice. You can't call your caregivers from home or from school every time you have a problem and go, okay, what do I do next? It's important for you to be able to use those things that you've been taught. Additionally, it's important to remember the people were in the wilderness. I mean, they had been in Egypt, which was very not wildernessy, and now they had moved out. So some of the things that may have been more plentiful and easier to access in Egypt, not so much now. So yeah, you can understand why they may be a little stressed. They were frightened and using emotion-based reasoning and not thinking clearly. This reminds me of when my son was little. He had an attachment to pacifiers, a really strong, usually he had one in each hand and one clipped to his shirt, attachment to pacifiers. And when it came time to break him from that attachment, I went online and I did a bunch of research, and ultimately the consensus seemed to be to cut the tip off of the pacifier so it didn't feel the same, and then they wouldn't like it and they wouldn't use it. Okay, so in my, young, not so wise self, I said, okay, let's try this. And instead of just doing one pacifier, I did all the pacifiers. And I gave it to him, and he put it in his mouth and he started to suck on it. And all of a sudden, his face turned bright red and he started screeching at me, "Fix it! Fix it!" And, of course, I couldn't put the pacifier back together. And I think this is kind of where the people were at this point. Moses had been gone for a while, and they were starting to feel really scared, really uneasy, and they wanted somebody to step up and fix it. Somebody needs to tell us what to do because we haven't learned to rely on ourselves and think for ourselves yet. God wouldn't have put people in this position without believing that they had the tools, that they had the knowledge. Just like a parent, we generally don't throw our kids into the deep end without making sure they know how to swim first. And generally, we don't throw them into the deep end. Don't get me wrong there. But God knew that He had already taught them distress tolerance skills. He had already taught them a lot of things. So think about what they had already learned. They had been oppressed. They had been in slavery, but they learned how to survive. Wow. Think about how much courage and character it must take to survive such an awful situation, but they did. They survived the Exodus. And remember, they kept trying to leave, and then the Pharaoh would bring them back, and they'd try to leave, and the Pharaoh would bring them back. But they were determined in what they were doing, and they recognized what they wanted and that they needed to endure. So great, they learned that. They were out in the wilderness with Moses and Aaron, and they started kvetching because they were thirsty. And they said, why did you bring us out here if we're just going to starve and die of thirst? And all they had to do was ask, and bada bing, Moses was able to produce water from a rock. Same thing when they said they were hungry. Moses let them know that God was going to provide food for them. And sure enough, it happened. Manna from heaven. We also see references to this in the New Testament in Matthew 7, verses 7 through 11, John 15:7, and 16:24, and Luke 11:9. What we want to look at is repeatedly we're told, ask and you will receive, knock and the door will be opened for you. But they didn't ask God to save them. They started screeching and asking Aaron, a mere mortal. How would Prudence, remember Prudence is a combination of patience and wisdom, how would Prudence have spared them? And I want you to reflect back to Genesis 3. And that's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. If she would have exercised patience and wisdom, if she would have followed directions, she would have, or they would have not been expelled from the Garden of Eden. God knows that they have courage, as evidenced by them leaving Egypt. He's given them the knowledge and tools to survive and even thrive where they are, through the lessons that they have been taught through oral tradition, because back then, we didn't have printing presses and stuff. So a lot of stuff was passed down through oral tradition, as well as through lived experience. He knows they have the tools. Could this have been a teaching moment, an attempt at what we call today scaffolding? And scaffolding is when a caregiver or a teacher teaches you the skills, helps you do it the first time, maybe, and then says, okay, now it's your turn. I'm here. And when you get stuck, I will help you the rest of the way, but I want you to start doing it. So maybe this was God's attempt of saying, all right, I know you've done much harder things, so I'm going to let you try to govern yourselves using what you have learned about good orderly direction, using my teachings. Maybe it was to remind them that Moses wasn't taking them out of Egypt. It was God. So instead of relying on Moses, they needed to fall back on good orderly direction. They needed to fall back on prayer. They needed to fall back on reflection of what they've been taught and what they know creates love and abundance. Think of times you've reacted based on emotion instead of acted based on facts. How did that turn out for you? A lot of times when we're in our emotional mind, we are reacting like my son did to his binky. Fix it. But when we can get into our wise mind, we can suddenly start consulting all of those lessons we've learned and say, okay, what's really happening here and what options do I have? How could prudence, including consulting God, thinking about all of the things that they know, all of the things that He has taught them, and endurance, which is courage and distress tolerance, how could that help you make better decisions? So how could it help you make better decisions to say, all right, I can be courageous. I've got this. It sucks right now and I don't like it, but I can endure it. I can tolerate this distress. And then I can consult God. I can consult my knowledge to figure out what to do next. What problem-solving skills had already been learned? Remember, every experience can be a lesson. And I've said so many times that what is in the Bible is not just in there willy-nilly. Everything in there has a purpose. And it's important for us to read it and reflect on that purpose. It's not just, oh, hey, that was a neat story. What are we supposed to learn from it? How is it supposed to shape and guide us to create this land of milk and honey, to create abundance, to create a godly world? So thinking back, Cain and Abel, way back in Genesis, as well as Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. What we learn from this is do your best. Share what you have, and jealousy and greed destroys people and families. Remember, Cain and Abel. Abel gave his best fruits to God, and Cain said, nah, I'm going to keep my best, and you can have, what I don't want. And God was very insulted. We need to share our best with everybody and not be selfish. Then Cain ended up murdering Abel because he was jealous. Now think about how that impacted his parents. Think about how that impacted his family. Isaac, Jacob, and Esau. Remember, Jacob stole Esau's birthright from Isaac. He deceived Isaac, which ended up causing a rift between Isaac and Rebekah because Rebekah was supporting Jacob's dishonesty. So it created a rift and a ripple in that family. Noah, from the story of Noah, God had become very displeased with the people, but Noah had done right. And it teaches us that we need to work together. Do what you've been told, and you'll survive. God will protect you. If you work together using good orderly direction, you will be safe. The Tower of Babel. And this is also kind of reflected when Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, top of Mount Sinai, and he says, y'all can't come with me. You need to stay down here. But the Tower of Babel, the people had gotten kind of full of themselves and thought they would build a tower to the heavens and make a name for themselves. So they were trying to become idols instead of recognizing the glory of God. So this one teaches us pride comes before a fall. If we think that we can ascend that high, then we're probably setting ourselves up for a rude awakening. Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah. This is another one of those that we see the story repeats itself. We didn't learn from the past. Abraham and Sarah, and at that point it was Abram and Sarai, were traveling during a famine. And when they came to a town, they lied and said that Sarah was Abram's sister because Abram was afraid God wouldn't protect him And Abram was afraid that the king would kill him in order to have Sarai or Sarah if he knew that Sarah was his wife. So he said, just say you're my sister. Well, then the king took her as to be his bride and found out that, hey, she's already married. So that's a big no-no here. Well, okay. So Abraham, or Abram at that point, created a rift and eliminated this kingdom potentially as a source of support because he showed that he was not trustworthy. Isaac and Rebekah, much later, a couple generations later, Isaac and Rebekah do the same exact thing. So it's important that we recognize and we learn from the past. We learn from our mistakes because doing the same thing and expecting different results ain't gonna happen. Abraham and Lot had been traveling together, and Lot was his kinfolk. I can't remember, but Lot was kinfolk, and Abraham and Lot's families had grown too big to be supported in this one plot of land. So Abraham said to Lot, choose which way you want to go. If you go right, I'll go left. If you go north, I'll go south. And that shows a recognition of abundance, that wherever we are, we can build a sustaining environment. We don't have to have the best land. It also shows selflessness, because Abraham wasn't saying, I'm the oldest, I'm going to keep the best for me, you can have anything else you want. He said, you choose. You choose, and I will make the best of whatever's left over. Abram rescues Lot. So they had parted ways, and they had done so very amicably. There wasn't any hard feelings between them. But then Lot gets into trouble in Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abram comes to his rescue. Even though he didn't have to, he did, because family first. And it also, Sodom and Gomorrah also teaches us the danger of lust and greed, because the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were just kind of bathing in unbridled lust, which, when they weren't able to meet their lustful desires, turned to murder. It's not a good thing. Sarah and Hagar, much later, Abraham's wife, Sarah, was not able to bear him children. So she said, have a child by Hagar. That way, at least there will be someone to carry on your name. And Leah and Rachel also sort of competed because Rachel was barren for a long time. But ultimately, the women, Sarah and Rachel, ended up becoming jealous of the offspring as well as the other woman. So it's important to recognize and be careful what you wish for. Yes, you may want this to happen, but if it's not happening, maybe there's a reason. Maybe you're not supposed to do that, and if you do, there are going to be consequences. Then Isaac and Rebekah is the next story. Remember, Isaac's father's servant went to find a wife for Isaac, and he went to this town and he prayed, let me find this woman that meets these criteria, and that I will know that that is the woman that God has chosen for you. And what we learn from this one is, again, ask and you'll receive, and what you need is often already there right before your eyes. So the servant had thought to himself, he had consulted God and said, what is it that my master needs? What behaviors will show me that this is a woman who will embody the needs of my master? He came up with the criteria, and all of a sudden there was this person who was right before him. Jacob, Leah, Rachel, and Laban. Now remember, when Jacob steals Esau's birthright, he has to flee because Esau is enraged. And he goes far away, and he meets Rachel and falls in love and wants to marry her. But Laban, Rachel's father, tricks him into marrying Leah first because she's the eldest, and then he has to work another 7 years in order to earn Rachel's hand. He does because he loves her dearly. When he's ready to go back to his family, Laban keeps moving the goalposts and changing it on him because Jacob has been very useful to him and helped create a lot of wealth for him. So what we see here is kind of what goes around comes around. Similar to what he did to his father by tricking his father to get the birthright, Laban is manipulating him in order to become more wealthy. Finally, Jacob breaks free and reunites with his brother Esau. He goes home. He realizes, you know what, this is not a good place. I need to go back to my people. So we learn from this lesson forgiveness, compassion, and the importance of family. Jacob goes back sort of with his tail between his legs and says, I screwed up. I'm sorry. I don't blame you for being completely enraged with me. But Esau has had a change of heart. Esau, just like when Joseph was sold into slavery, which we're going to get to in a minute, recognized a bad situation, but instead of holding on to that anger, he said, okay, what's happened has happened. I will make the best of what's going on right now, and became very successful in his own right. And then we move to the story of Joseph being born to Jacob and ultimately sold into slavery. Forgiveness is important. Joseph doesn't hold a grudge against his brothers for selling him into slavery. He's like, well, crap, I am here. He made the best of a bad situation, and he has a lot of lumps along the way. But each time he has a setback, instead of stewing in anger and resentment and hopelessness, he says, okay, what can I do to make the best of this situation? What's the best way to use my energy to be as comfortable as possible in this setting? Joseph ultimately gains favor of the Pharaoh before the famine, and becomes extremely powerful and wealthy, and is ultimately able to save his family from a famine that's going on. But we learn from this the importance of preparation and saving and avoiding gluttony and sloth. If Joseph wouldn't have prepared for those 7 years of famine, even though they were in the middle of 7 years of great abundance, if he hadn't prepared for those 7 years of famine, everybody would have perished. Then we move to Exodus 2, and this is the people's lived experience. As I mentioned, they've already shown great courage, being able to survive the oppression of slavery. In Exodus 2, Moses, who is being raised by the Potiphar's daughter, disavows them and says, no, I'm not an Egyptian, I'm a Hebrew, and stands up for what he believes. He resists oppression and recognizes that the right thing is not always the easy or the comfortable thing. He had it really good. He was living in the castle and everything, and he disavowed all that, and he said, no, what's going on here is not right, and I'm going to do what I can to make it right. In Exodus 7 through 11, this is when we go through all of the trials, when the people are trying to leave Egypt, and then every time they try to leave, the king brings them back, and then God strikes the king with a plague, and they do it again. We talked in that Bible study about the fact that this may have been in part to develop people's motivation and their courage, because maybe they weren't quite ready to go the full distance yet. So God was trying to help people develop their resolve, maybe. In Exodus 18, 13 through 22, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, sees that he is working himself to death, trying to be the only mouthpiece, the only judge of all of the people. And there's just too many people. They've become way too abundant. So Jethro says, you have the knowledge to do this, but it's important to appoint judges who will speak for you. And then only the hardest cases will come to you. So Moses kind of became sort of like the Supreme Court. Through this, God had created the societal structure to sustain what's going on, and provided that the people continued to appoint judges who were godly in nature, it would help sustain and maintain that belief system and those behaviors in that community. And then we come to Exodus 20 through 23, the commandments and various laws to help people stay safe and healthy and begin uniting in what will eventually be the body of Christ. But right now, it's God. It's good, orderly direction. God is teaching the people what they need to do to stay safe and healthy and create abundance. They're not going to be able to create the universe like he did, but they can create a world where they're happy and healthy. Many of the commandments are things that were already implicitly taught through prior experiences and prior stories, but sometimes we don't see the implicit. Other parts of the commandments are just common decency. And again, God made those explicit for the people. And this is all before Moses goes up Mount Sinai. He's saying, okay, let's just go over the rules here because I'm getting ready to go on a trip. And y'all need to know what to do in my absence in order to not only survive, but to thrive. So God, through Moses, was preparing the people to take responsibility for themselves before Moses was to ascend Mount Sinai and receive the tablets. So what are some of these lessons? Well, the first one, God is the only true God, and it's important not to get distracted by worshiping false idols because it leads to greed, gluttony, pride, lust, wrath, and envy, which you may recognize as the deadly sins. We talked in earlier Bible studies about the fact that anything that you put before God, anything that you put before good orderly direction becomes a god or an idol in and of itself. So thinking, when you're solving problems, do you first think, what is the godly thing to do? Or do you think, what is going to make me the most money? Or what is going to help me get ahead in this world? The next lesson is that rest, reflection, and community are important. God even rests to look at what he has done after he's created the universe and to appreciate it in order to maintain our motivation, in order to recognize, what's the point of all this hard work? We need to take a step back and pick our head up and look around and go, wow, look at how far we've come. Look at what we've done. And connect with each other in the community because no one person can do everything by themselves. So this day of rest and reflection was a time for them to come out of the fields and connect with one another and solidify those social bonds. So there was a network of support within the community. Respect your parents and God the Father. It's important to respect parents because they are teaching children who don't have knowledge. Parents have that knowledge and wisdom. Don't kill. Okay, that's another one of those that's kind of straightforward, but we did learn that from Cain and Abel. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't lie. We saw lying in the story of Abraham and Sarah. Don't envy. Look back up to false idols above. When you envy something, you are angry that somebody else has it and you don't, which means you're putting yourself before God. You're putting yourself before the community instead of being grateful for what you have and happy for them. And then there are more explicit social justice laws that are elucidated. I'm not going to go through all of those again here, but you can go back into Exodus and look at them. And they make sense, especially given the time frame. You know, the consequences for certain actions make sense considering the impact of those actions in that time period. History repeats itself, but the context may change. And it's important for us to recognize this. We can learn lessons from the past, but then we have to take those lessons and apply them and say, how does this work in this particular situation? And what can I do differently? Instead of fearing that someone else is going to take advantage of me and lying to try to avoid that, how could I act differently? What would be a more godly way to respond? So instead of acting like Isaac and Rebekah or Abraham and Sarah, how could I approach this situation differently in this context? What do I know now? What have I learned now? How have I grown? Keep doing the same things, you're going to get the same results. We see this and we're going to see it over and over again. What can you learn from each experience that you have had? Think back over your experiences, the good ones, as well as the not so good ones. And the good ones, you want to look at them and go, yeah, that was an awesome experience. But what did you learn from it, aside from the fact that it made you happy? What did you learn from the unpleasant experiences about yourself, about others, about the world, about the best way to react in the future? How might good orderly direction have encouraged you to act differently? And if you would have used good orderly direction in some of those situations, what would have happened? Instead of acting emotionally or impulsively or selfishly, what would have happened? Even though you can't see God himself, where do you see God at work? Where do you see his hand? We see plants. You plant plants and they grow from this little tiny seed, and that's just miraculous. We see the ecosystem and how everything is intertwined. If a particular plant or animal goes extinct, it has ripple effects on the whole ecosystem. The same thing is true for humans. Everything is intertwined and we all need each other. Likewise, as humans, if we are disrespectful to the ecosystem, it's not going to sustain us. It's not going to produce the food we need. We see God's hand in relationships, how we are brought together with people who are able to help us, to synergize. If we are just willing to set our pride aside and say, instead of saying, I need to compete with you, or I need to do it all by myself, how can we work together? And that work extrapolates to communities. Good orderly direction, when people are practicing the principles of good orderly direction, it strengthens communities. And generally in those communities, you don't see people struggling or suffering because everybody's supporting one another. I mean, think about Amish communities, for example. They work together. How does good orderly direction help you stay safe and move toward abundance, or what they're calling right now, a land of milk and honey? How does using the principles of prudence, earnestness, respect, forgiveness, endurance, compassion, truthfulness, and selflessness, how does that help you create an environment that is not only sustaining, but will help you grow and experience abundance? Embrace the dialectics. Always remember to ask yourself, what am I supposed to learn from this experience? Were there similar situations in the Bible? How could I apply those lessons to this situation? Envy, for example. We see envy and jealousy multiple times in Genesis. So we want to think, what could we learn from that? What could we learn in terms of how we should behave in the present, in that whole selflessness thing? If you're looking for information about lessons in the Bible, you can start with openbible.info/topics. It's important, and it even says it on their page, not to just take that one verse that you're finding and assume you know what it means. You need to read the whole chapter to get it in context, because context is always important. God has provided us with everything we need to be happy and healthy. He's provided the earth, other people, knowledge. We just need to educate ourselves about what to do and put the knowledge to use. Knowing it and doing it are two different things. And once you start implementing good, orderly direction, it creates an amazing transformation. In Micah 6:8, it says, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and walk humbly with your God."